from the rest of I give you this just merely as speculation. You take it for what it's worth. But it's almost as if the writer gets about halfway through this and he looks back at his writings and he sees the darkness in it. And he says, let me pause here for a minute and make sure you understand I'm not completely dismissing wisdom. I'm not telling you wisdom is a horrible thing. Let me spend a few minutes telling you some good things that you can learn from wisdom. But yet it appears that even as he does this, he then says, no, I got to get back and tell you what things are like under the sun. So kind of consider that frame of mind as we look through this. And when we look at this first section, really the first 11 verses or so, actually maybe even a little more than that, of chapter 7 are going to tell us some good things. All right, some things are better than others. You're living on the earth, you're living with people who are practicing their lifestyle under the sun with all of the problems and such as that, but yet there are certain things that are consistent that you need to have. And I think that the first line that he gives here is one of the most important things we can teach our children. We may not be able to discuss everything with the book of Ecclesiastes with a 5-year-old, but we can get this down. And that's when he says, a good name is better than precious ointment. So, though things might be miserable, though things might be bad under the sun, he says one thing that you can count on is that if you have a good name, that's something very valuable. The idea here of the ointment, the rich perfume that could be bought and you would spend a lot of money on that, contrasts very nicely with the section we just came out of. You can spend money on lots of stuff, but nothing is as valuable as your reputation. And I think that's such an important lesson for all of us and how easily that's damaged and how we need to teach our children that very thing. And we'll see that again a little bit later on when we talk about the fly and the ointment. Just a little bit of foolishness can destroy that. The next part gets a little more philosophical because here is the acceptance of what's coming. So we pick up at the end of verse 1. And he says, this is something good to understand, the day of death over against the day of birth. It is better to go into the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. That's tough. Because we live in a culture that runs from death. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to think about it. In fact, one of the very interesting things, sometime just go through your mind of all the euphemisms we have instead of someone died. They passed on. They passed away. You know, we've got all of these much more pleasant sounding things because we just don't want to consider that. It's coming. If the Lord doesn't intervene, all of us have got that date that's coming when our hearts will stop, the last breath will be drawn, and we'll be gone. And so our writer says, here's something good. Spend time in the house of death. Spend time thinking about it. Spend time contemplating it. Again, I think that's something important to teach our children. I know parents disagree with me, and so I'm going to go off rail a little bit and just tell you my opinion. I've never shied from taking my children to the funeral home from the time they were very young on, because I want that to get ingrained, that what begins comes to an end. The writer here is saying that if we do that, it's going to cause us to think deeper than we would otherwise. If we're living a lifestyle of just saying, I'm going to rack it all up, I'm just living for the moment here, we're never going to fully appreciate that final destiny that we have with God. And so he says, spend time there, contemplate that this is the end of mankind. The living are going to lay it to heart. I think especially with verse 3, sometimes hard for us to understand when he says sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. He's not condemning being happy. He's not condemning being joyful, laughing. But he's talking about the kind of lifestyle that's surface, where everything's a joke. Everything is funny. He's saying if that's your concept of life, then you're never really going to figure out what it's all about. You're never going to figure out why God has put you here. And so he says, when you get that figured out, it's going to bring a heartening experience. And he says, if you just sit around with a bunch of fools who are always living in the moment and they're always making a joke of everything, he's saying that's going to be like a bunch of sticks crackling under a fire. You're not going to get what you need from that. So let's never get caught up in our culture. I'm not saying we need to have this obsessive view of death. I think some people go to that extreme. But it's the idea that we fully, intellectually, emotionally accept the fact that it's going to happen. And when we can do that, we're going to understand better what life is all about. And part of that is being around people who can really help us. This is the idea we were alluding to about being with the wise rather than the fool. Look at verses 5 and 6. He says, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This is vanity." What would you rather hear? Would you rather hear somebody telling you what a great person you are? What a charming individual you are? What a good personality you have? How much fun you are? How you're the life of the party? Or somebody who says, you spend way too much thinking about material possessions. You spend way too much time trying to build up things that are not going to go with you. Now, which of those would you rather hear? Honest answer. Honest. We know. We like to hear people heap the praises up on us, don't we? We like to hear people talk about how good we are and how much fun we are, and to an extent there's nothing wrong with that. But if it's all of that and none of the rebuke, it's like trying to live a lifestyle off chocolate cake. What's good in moderation will kill us in excess. That's what the writer's saying. Now, here's our problem. We oftentimes get a little angry when people rebuke us. Who do they think they are telling me that? Who's that person who's telling me? And we kind of, rile our backs up. I'll just have to tell you, in getting close to 30 years of education, I've seen a change. I've seen parents who will come to the defense of their child no matter what. The child may be as wrong as sin, but the parent doesn't want to hear that rebuke of the child. That's a dangerous situation. Because if children grow up never being rebuked, then they begin to feel entitled. Everything ought to be happiness and roses and jolliness. And don't ever tell me I'm doing anything wrong. Do we see that in modern religion? Let's talk a lot about the good things and never anything about the bad. Let's never rebuke. You see the application here. The preacher says, listen to rebuke. That's what's going to make you grow. That's what's going to make you more what you need to be. That's something good. But now he's going to tie in with this another aspect of wisdom. And he says things are good, and one of the things that's good is when you view wisdom realistically. Let's look at verse 7. He says, surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and the bribe corrupts the heart. Wisdom is good. Proverbs says it, Job says it, Ecclesiastes says it. But remember, Job and Ecclesiastes are giving us the full picture. And what the writer here is saying to us is this: wise people can mess up. Wise people can make some very serious mistakes. Again, note what he says, oppression drives the wise into madness. Sometimes this under-the-sun lifestyle brings someone who got it back to the point that they don't. I think a lot of times this happens, especially when we go through a period of intense struggle religiously. Maybe trouble in a local church, or maybe between two brothers or whatever. And it's just a nasty situation. People aren't behaving like they ought, and gossip and bad names being called and all of this. And someone who at one point was very spiritually minded says, if this is what religion is all about, I want nothing to do with it. It's a danger. And our writer here is saying, don't think that wisdom is something that once you get it, you're never going to lose it. He's saying even the wise in their oppression can go back into the ways of the world. And certainly here, verse 7, the latter part of it, a bribe can corrupt the heart. I had a man who was talking about studying with some folks who are way up in preaching, had become preachers in very large churches, and was explaining the ways of baptism. And he said, those men looked him square in the eye and said, you're right, but if I preach this, I'll get fired. My friend said, well, thank you for your honesty. That's a bribe corrupting the heart. Here is a good income, a lifestyle you enjoy with the acclamation, if I preach this, they'll fire me. That's what he's talking about. Wisdom doesn't solve every problem. Wisdom is not going to somehow build this shield around you where you're never going to mess up. Not at all. So the writer is saying, understand wisdom realistically. Now, the next section is one that I find particularly interesting. He says in verse 8, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. I don't know if you're like me or not, but I struggle with my patience. I really do. It's something that I work on and I try. But it's one of those things that I find very hard to master. I like for things to be finished, to be done, so I can move on to something else. And what the writer says is, you got to be very careful that you don't grow in this proud heart of saying, I'm going to solve every problem just as quickly as I possibly can and move on to the next. He says, the one who is patient in spirit, the one who realizes that certain things take time to accomplish, is going to be much better than the guy who wants to proclaim, look at all that I've done. We see this a lot in athletics, don't we? A lot of times, young man, young woman, they look at the trophy and say, I want that. But then they look at what's got to happen for that to take place, and they say, I want none of that. I don't want to get up at 5 o'clock and practice every morning. I don't want to be out at 7 p.m. running every night. They're not patient in spirit. Now, what our writer is going to do is he's going to give us an example of that. All right, so here is the illustration in verses 9 and 10. He says, do not be quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. One of the things very much associated with impatience is anger, right? It's anger because things aren't going quickly enough for us. People ought to be doing this or that so that my goal can be accomplished. And our writer says, if you're that impatient person who's always angry at everybody else because they're not doing what he or she wants them to do, you're a fool. Flat out, that's what you are. And anger is residing within you. And what is residing in your bosom is going to burn you. And he says, you got to put all of that away. And then to illustrate his point, he says, don't talk about the good old days. Don't talk about the good old days. Look at verse 10 again. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. I was Sunday talking to a student I had about 15 years ago. And he was regaling with me of all the things he did in class. And I said, I don't remember any of that. And I said, the good thing is, time washes away unpleasant memories. Just washes them away. You know, I'll have, especially boys, will come up and say, I was the worst boy in your class. And I'll very honestly say, I don't remember anything you did. You know, because that's a good thing about time, isn't it? But here's the danger. We tend to say, when I was a child, things sure were better than they are now. When I was a kid, we had it made. When I was a kid, and what's interesting is, you've got adults who are saying that about their childhood, and you had adults in their childhood who are saying, these are horrible times. Boy, back in my day, we didn't have any of this trouble. That's impatience. Because what it's saying is this: when I get to the end of something, it's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. But it's forgetting what it means to get there. Life, no matter when you live, is going to be filled with hard times. No matter when you live, there's going to be evil. There's going to be people doing wrong. There's going to be people living under the sun. And so the writer says, don't spend all of your time in the past, talking about the glory days. He's saying, you live in the present. And you deal with what's going on here patiently. Don't be impatient about the present, always recalling the better times of the past. You be patient in the day in which you're living. And can I issue this challenge to every one of us, and I'm pointing a finger metaphorically right at myself here. When you're talking to kids, don't bask in the glory of the old days. They were not good. If you go back then, they were not what you remember them being. Don't make young people's present seem something bad. They have as much excitement and energy and enthusiasm and optimism as you did when you were their age. Don't rob them of that. That's what our writer is saying. So he's saying the best thing is be patient with where you are and accept what wisdom can do for you. And interestingly, he's going to give a shout out to having a little wealth here also. Look at verses 11 and 12. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. Look at his language. They're not under the sun here. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. And the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. He's spent a lot of time talking about, you can't tell the wise man from the fool 100 years from now. But now he's saying wisdom does offer some protection. Just like money offers protection. It's a good thing. One time we started on a trip and we both turned to each other and asked the fateful question, did you pick up the money we were going to bring? And both of us answered negatively to that. That's a kind of a bad feeling. You're 100 miles from home and you don't have any cash with you. Money can be a good thing, can it? If it's used wisely, if it's used correctly. Your parents leave you this nice inheritance. Well, that's a good thing if you use it correctly. And so our writer here says some things are better, and wisdom is a good thing when used appropriately. Wealth is a good thing when used appropriately. And then he kind of ties all of this together when he says in verse 13 and verse 14, consider the work of God who can make straight what has been made crooked. In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Kind of a mini carpe diem moment again. He's saying, trust though that God's got it all under control. Accept that. That's one of his problems throughout this book. It's kind of this aggravation that God's got on the hamster wheel. But here he's saying, realize that God's got it under control. And that's going to make your life better. So here are some of the good things. Kind of a brief light that we have in the midst of the darkness of under the sun kind of thinking. Now, let's go ahead and move to our next section here. As we look in verses 15 down through 18, he says, in my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. All right, we're back now, aren't we, to the under the sun life. Do not be overly righteous and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. When we look at this part of the book, very much like the book of Job, it's striking out against the concept of retribution. Because you are good does not mean good things are always going to happen to you. Because you are bad does not mean bad things are always going to happen to you. Sometimes good things happen to bad people, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. So the writer here is saying you need to realize that. And then he launches into this idea of don't be overly righteous and don't be overly wicked in all of this. Now, let me ask you, is the writer here talking about moderation? You know, don't be too good, but don't be too bad. Just kind of keep it between the lines here. If that's what he was talking about, it would fly in the face of every other thing we find in the Bible. So I highly doubt that's his message. So what is he saying when he says, don't be overly righteous? What he's saying is don't become a self-righteous person. Here's someone, maybe some things have gone well, and they say, well, God surely is pleased with me. God is blessing me so in this good life that I'm living for Him. Don't get like that. Don't think that somehow your goodness is going to be paid by God. Oh, you've been good this month. Hey, here's an extra $1,000 for you. It's not retribution. It's not how it works. So the idea is don't be overly righteous. Don't be self-righteous. Righteousness is not going to solve your life's problems. You can be a very righteous person. You need to be a righteous person. But sometimes bad things are going to happen, and righteousness is not going to prevent it. Righteousness is not going to keep your house from burning down. Righteousness is not going to keep you from getting cancer. Righteousness is not going to mean someday you lose your job. Don't be in this way of thinking that if I just live exactly like God wants me to, everything's going to go my way. That's self-righteousness. But then he says, on the other hand, don't go to the opposite extreme. Don't go to the point of saying, well, if things aren't going to go great for me because I'm righteous, I'm just going to live an unrighteous life. What's the difference anyway? He says, don't be overly wicked. Don't allow that to happen to your life. And so what he's saying is this: make sure that you're living by the standard of God. Make sure that you're pursuing the things that need to be pursued. This is going to tie right in with what follows. We're not really changing thoughts at all here in this. All right, so we look down then to verse 19, and he says, wisdom gives strength to the wise, more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. Look at what he's saying here. Once again, a plug for wisdom. Wisdom is good. Wisdom is good, but wisdom does not prevent unrighteousness. We've not really changed gears. Here is a wise person who's behaving in an unwise way. And he gives us an example of that. This is one that if you and I are honest with ourselves, we surely know that we're guilty. Somebody gossips about you. Now raise your hand if nobody's ever gossiped about you. I think I'm saying 100%. All right, so we've all been gossiped on. How many of you liked it? Still at 100%. You don't have to answer this one. How many of us thought, I can't believe that man, that woman would treat me like that. I mean, of all things, that person's a Christian. And over there gossiping about me and saying all of this, that's the most ungodly person I think I've ever met in my life. Boy, we can get on a roll, can't we? What does the writer tell us to do? Stop. You ever done that? You don't have to raise your hand on this one either. How many of us have gossiped about others, about other Christians? Suddenly, that high horse we're riding on throws us. And the writer says, remember now, don't be overly righteous. Don't get to the point in your self-righteousness to think that you can look down on everybody who's done something to you and forget that you have done the exact same thing to others. So therefore, be very, very cautious. I don't know about you, that passage just stings me a little bit. I like to skip it when I come to Ecclesiastes, but we don't need to do that. That's something that is so striking to us. All right, let's go ahead. Our time is escaping here. Let's go ahead on down to this next section. Again, we're not leaving the idea of wisdom, but let's look and see what he says here within it. He says, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Our writer here says, my search was motivated by wisdom. This journey that I've been on is motivated by wisdom, but when I look at my life, I'm a failure. You ever felt like that? I certainly have. You think I'm trying as hard as I can, but as I look at all of my mistakes, I find that I'm a failure. That's what this guy is talking about also. But he tells us, though I consider myself a failure, there's some things I've learned on this journey. Let's look and see what he says that he's learned on it. We go ahead on down to verse 24. And he says, that which has been is far off, very deep. Who can find it out? I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the schemes of things, and to know the wisdom of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and net, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly. But I have not found one man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. All right, let's talk about what he's looking at in this section. He said, I've lived my life by wisdom, and I'm a failure in that. But yet in my journey, look at what I have determined. He said, I've made discoveries here. First of all, I found a woman who is fetters. She's a snare and fetters. All right, pop quiz. Does this remind anybody of another book in the Bible? The woman who's standing at the city gate and she's looking for the foolish young man to come by. And you remember the book? Proverbs, right? Here's Proverbs and standing there and waiting for the young man to come. All right, that's sounding very much like what we find especially over in Proverbs chapter 9. We'll not read that this morning. But there's several places where evil is personified by a woman. You got two women in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom and the woman of sin. So he's saying basically in this journey, I have found evil. I have seen a lot of people who've been ensnared. He also says, this is no shock to us, he says, I've also found, as I've made this journey, hardly anybody amongst the human race who is wise. Now, a lot of women look at this section and are a little offended by it. I would encourage you not to be. I don't think that's the point that he's making. When he says, I've looked through all 1,000 men and I found one man who was wise, but I didn't find any women. I think what the writer is saying here is this. There's hardly anybody out there who's wise. One person out of all these I've examined that I've found wisdom. So very few are. Now, let's go ahead a little bit further. And he says the third discovery is that man has been created in a very upright way, yet man has rejected that. Man has gone against those things. This is what his journey has brought him to see. And that's what we find in this section of chapter 7. So, started out with all of these things that are better, but yet he says wisdom, when not applied, is not going to produce anything that's very good. All right. Let's go ahead, and we'll get as far as we can in chapter 8. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of it, but let's go ahead and at least look at a few of the things that he says here regarding this. In the first 3 verses, he says, who is like the wise? Note, we're not leaving our wisdom behind. And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Little bit of a change of gears, but we're still in the context of wisdom. The writer here turns his attention to obedience to the king. Now, who puts kings in their position of power? It's God, right? God tells us that He brings them up, He takes them down. And so the writer says God has put him there. We find that in both sections of the wisdom literature. But then he goes on to say, you be very, very careful when you get involved in some evil cause about the king. Now, I think this can go one of 2 ways. He's showing us here how under the sun we get ourselves into a great deal of trouble. First of all, a plot to bring the king down. Let me ask you, even in places today like North Korea, if you are found in a plot against the dictator, what happens to you? You're killed. That's right. You're taken out behind the barn and you're shot. Happens all the time, doesn't it, when somebody's trying to bring it down? And so here's the writer saying to you, remember, God's put the leader in position. You be awfully careful about getting involved in those kinds of things. Maybe a little bit more practically speaking, though, he says, don't act foolishly in the presence of the king. Don't do something that's going to bring undue attention to yourself in His presence. Both of those are showing a complete lack of wisdom. Now, how is all of this tying in? Again, we're seeing when he's saying, I don't find many wise people on the face of the earth. He's giving us an example that there's a whole lot of folks who do this kind of thing and they get themselves in trouble. And so in the next section, he's going to go on and he's going to tell us nobody outranks the king. Nobody is bigger than he is and better. So when you behave yourself and you're a good, upstanding citizen, that's most likely going to bring you reward rather than punishment. That's not a steadfast rule. But if you're behaving yourself wisely in the presence of the king, he's saying, more likely as not, you're going to be okay. That's wisdom. Now, if you look on down to verse 6, interestingly in this, he says, there is a time and a way for everything, although man's troubles lie heavy on him. He's again saying, even though things might not look like they're going as they ought, take time to remember God's in control. God's got the plan going on here, and you may not know that plan. That's what verse 7 is saying. But even though you don't know the plan, don't rebel against what you think is an unwise ruler. Is that some pretty solid advice? Where he's saying, live your life. Don't think that you've got to always be involved in all of these shenanigans that are going on in the political courts. You understand that you work within God's plan even when you don't understand it. And then he says, look, hurt may still come. Hurt may still occur. But don't give up on that. All right, so the first part of this chapter then is saying, be wise in recognizing God's put this guy on the throne. God's going to take care of the situation. As far as depends on you, use wisdom to live peaceably in all of this. And even if pain should come, trust God. Don't give up on His plan. All right, I wanted to make sure today we get down to the section on verses 10 through 14, because I think this is an important section for us to look at here. Let's just take a few minutes and read these verses. He says, "Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and they were praised in the city where they had gone and done such things. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before Him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, and there are righteous people to whom it happens according to their deeds, according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this is also vanity." I realize when you spend 80 minutes on the book of Proverbs, things can start getting a little mushy here. But if you just took this passage and isolated it, it sounds like the most contradictory thing you can understand. He starts out by saying in this, look, the wicked here, they're in the holy places while they're living. Here they are, they walk around strutting about, wicked, terrible lifestyles, walking around in holy areas, and everybody just loves them. Everybody just thinks they're great. And then he says they die, and then they say, oh, he was just the greatest guy ever. Most wicked man you could find, but he was just wonderful. He always did all these things. Does that sound good to you? That the wicked should be praised both before and after death? No. But we know that happens. Our struggle with this, though, is what we find in verses 12 and 13. Because this seems to contradict what he just said and what he's going to follow with in verse 14. Because in 12 and 13 he says, "Sinner does evil 100 times, prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before Him. And it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God." And then he follows that immediately in verse 14 saying, "But good people are hurt by bad folks." You see what he's done? The wicked strut about and they're evil, they're praised. Wickedness doesn't pay. Righteous get hurt by wickedness. Let me tell you what I think he's doing here. I think in verses 12 and 13, he's giving us a sampling of wisdom teaching. 12 and 13 would fit perfectly in the book of Proverbs. In fact, you could find that idea there with no problem whatsoever. And I think he's also giving us just a little bit of his own confusion here. He's saying, I hear those things, but what I'm seeing is not taking place. And really what appears to be a contradiction is just a very good way of contrasting and showing us this is what happens to life under the sun. Here's what goes on when you're living with all of these folks who don't behave themselves. This is how it should be. This is how it is. And so here then he's saying it's a confusing thing, but nonetheless, what do we find? There is no justice. Clicked it too far here. There is no justice that's going to be found under the sun. Now, what do you and I know we could do with verses 12 and 13? We could eternalize that, couldn't we? We could say, well, absolutely. The righteous will be rewarded in eternity. The wicked will punish. But I'm not sure that's what our writer is doing. I think what he's saying to us is you look at this and you see that when you're living under the sun, this is how life is going to be. All right, while the herd is coming back in, let me just say this. The final part of chapter 8 is another carpe diem moment. Take some time to read that this afternoon. It's again, enjoy life for the moment, but understand that God is in control. And he ends this section very much like he's ended the other sections that we've looked at. All right, Lord willing, tomorrow we'll finish the book up. We're getting to the light at the end of the tunnel. We're almost to chapter 12 when we can see the fruits of all of